take you back in time. On December 19th, 2025, President Donald J. Trump stood in the White House and announced that 14 of America's largest pharmaceutical companies had reached most favored nation pricing agreements with the federal government, saying, quote, "This represents the greatest victory for patient affordability in the history of American healthcare by far." Greatest victory in the history of American healthcare by far. 12 days later, it was reported that those same companies were planning to raise prices on at least 350 branded medications beginning January 1st, 2026. And all this happened in 12 days. By the time January was 2 weeks old, 46 Brooklyn, a nonprofit drug pricing research firm, had tracked price increases of 872 brand name drugs from the same companies that had stood in the White House and shaken the president's hand and said they were going to have most favored nation pricing agreements with the federal government in order to make sure that Americans had price affordability in their healthcare. 872 drugs. Today, we're going to talk about what happened in those 12 days and what it means for the president's agenda, for every American filling a prescription, and for the question of whether a handshake with Big Pharma is worth anything at all. Welcome back to Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. And I want to open today by saying something very clearly because I think it's important when we have this conversation about price parity on prescription drugs. What the president set out to do with drug pricing is right. The direction is right. The instinct is right. The pressure is right. Because Americans pay 3 to 5 to 8 times more than what other developed countries pay for the exact same drugs from the exact same factories. And the President of the United States looked at that arrangement and said, it ends today. That's the correct position. That is what leadership looks like. And the 14 companies that came to the table did so because they felt genuine pressure from an administration that was serious about holding them accountable. I'm not here today to say that the president failed. I'm here today to say he was lied to. I'm here today to say that these 14 drug companies tried to play the president of the United States. And the evidence is documented, it's numbered, and it's time-stamped. So let's walk through it. The most favored nation agreements, as announced, required participating companies to do several things. Sell existing medications to Medicaid at prices available in peer countries, set U.S. launch prices for new drugs at parity with comparable nations, and offer discounts to cash-paying patients through TrumpRx.gov. And if the administration successfully pressed other countries to pay more, raising international prices, essentially, they were to return a portion of that increase to American patients. In exchange, these 14 pharmaceutical companies got 3 years of tariff relief. The White House was explicit. Health and Human Services declared in January of 2026, quote, "The days of big pharma price gouging are over. President Trump has ensured every American gets the lowest prices on prescription medications in the developed world. Every American, lowest prices. That is the promise." But that's not what these 14 companies did. 12 days after the president's announcement, it was reported, based on data from healthcare research firm 3 Axis Advisors, that drug makers were planning to raise prices on at least 350 branded medications on the first day of 2026. Companies had deals with the federal government. These companies had deals with the President of the United States. These companies had just publicly committed to most favored nation pricing. Among those planning increases, Pfizer, the first company to sign a deal with the administration, which raised prices on 72 products in January alone, including a 15% increase on its COVID vaccine. There was Merck, which raised prices on 18 products. GSK, which increased prices on around 20 drugs and vaccines by between 2 and nearly 9% of their original costs. The companies just continue to list and list and raise and raise. By mid-January, 46 Brooklyn had tracked 872 brand name drug prices increasing in the first 2 weeks of the year. From all of the deal signers, every single one raised the price on at least something. Now, the White House responded. They said list prices don't really matter. What matters is net price. The price is after rebates in negotiations. And Pfizer added in its own defense that while list prices went up, the prices insurance companies actually pay them after discounts and rebates went down. The argument's worth examining because it's not entirely wrong. Net prices, the prices that are actually paid after rebates, are in many cases lower than list prices. This is a real distinction, but here is the problem with that argument. The uninsured patient. The patient in the deductible phase of their plan. The patient whose drug isn't on their formulary. Those patients, tens of millions of Americans, do not benefit from the net price. They pay list price. And that list price went up on 872 drugs in the first 2 weeks of January in 2026, including drugs sold by companies that had publicly promised to lower them for American patients. This is not a technicality. This is who these deals were supposed to help, and they were the very first people that were abandoned in the new year. Now let's talk about new drugs, because the agreement wasn't just about existing drugs. It was supposed to set launch prices for new drugs at parity with peer countries. That was one of the explicit commitments that these 14 companies made to the President of the United States. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee minority staff analyzed what happens to new drug launch prices from the companies that signed the agreement. And here's what they found, that since the end of 2025, those companies have rolled out 23 new prescription drugs, which is great. Thank you for the innovation. Here's the kicker. The average price for one of those drugs is $353,000 per year per patient. Some treatments now exceed $1 million for a single course. One medication jumped by almost $200,000 in price, reaching $2.6 million for a single course of treatment. $353,000 a year, on average, for new drugs launched by companies that signed most favored nation pricing deals with the President of the United States in the White House that was supposed to benefit American patients. Now, what does $353,000 a year look like as a most favored nation price? What does it look like compared to what Germany pays, or France, or Japan? The Senate Help Committee Minority Report found that one drug being launched at $389,100 in the United States was available in Canada for $88,100, and in France for $37,900, and in Japan, $37,900. That drug, priced at $389,100 in the United States, was launched after the company signed an MFN agreement. That's not alignment. That is the exact arrangement that existed before the deal. That company signed on the dotted line and then launched a drug 10 times the Japanese price. And they called it compliance. I don't know about you, but that's not called keeping your word. That's not being compliant. That's not being honest. All right, so let me give you the financial picture for those companies in 2025. Because when companies tell us they need high prices to fund innovation and stay viable, the numbers should reflect that. Of the MFN deal signers, combined, they pulled in about $177 billion in profit in 2025. $177 billion with a B in profit in 1 year. Of that, they returned $97.3 billion to shareholders, and they spent another $34 billion on stock buybacks. Executive compensation for those same companies totaled nearly $346 million. To summarize, $177 billion in profit, $97 billion back to shareholders, $34 billion in stock buybacks, and $346 million to the executives who managed all of this. And then 12 days after shaking the president's hand on a most favored nation pricing deal, they raised prices on 872 drugs. I need to be careful about something here. I'm not arguing that profit is wrong. Profit is not wrong. Profit is the engine of the American economy. Companies that take risk deserve return. What I am arguing is that $177 billion in profit with $97 billion back to shareholders and $34 billion in stock buybacks in a single year does not describe a sector that needs patient-funded monopoly pricing to survive. It describes a sector that is extracting the maximum possible revenue from a captive market and calling the extraction innovation. And it describes a sector that, when asked to extend a hand in partnership with the President of the United States, extended that hand while keeping their other one busy filing the price increase paperwork. Why does this keep happening? It's not because the companies are uniquely evil, though their behavior is indefensible, but because the structure of these agreements make it nearly inevitable. The MFN deals are voluntary. They are not statute. They are not enforceable law. They do not carry legal penalties for noncompliance. They do not define precisely which drugs are covered, which patients benefit, or what constitutes a violation. Now compare that to what the Inflation Reduction Act did for Medicare drug prices. The IRA created a legally enforceable framework. It published negotiated prices, specific drugs, statutory penalties for noncompliance, and when those negotiated prices took effect in January of 2026, the prices came down. In some cases by 38 to 79% on the first 10 drugs that they negotiated. Not because the companies wanted to lower the price, they didn't, but because the law required them to, with consequences if they didn't. Voluntary versus statutory. That is the difference. And from the Pharmaceutical Reform Alliance say they are more likely to support a candidate who prioritizes codifying most favored nation drug pricing, they are right too. The question is whether Congress can or will deliver. And we're starting to see evidence that Congress is listening. Earlier this year, Republican Democrat lawmakers proposed an amendment to the congressional budget resolution that included a measure to codify most favored nation drug pricing into law. A bipartisan amendment, both parties in the current Congress proposing to write the president's own drug pricing policy into statute. But the amendment didn't pass. But the fact that it existed, the fact that members from both parties were willing to put their names on legislation that the pharmaceutical industry's $452 million annual lobbying operation had spent years killing tells you something about where political momentum is. The industry knows it too. That's why they showed up at the Politico Healthcare Summit and called most favored nation pricing codification, quote, the wrong policy prescription. That is why they sent lobbyists to tell Republican members of Congress that writing the president's drug pricing order into law would somehow harm American innovation. The same argument they always make. The same argument that, as we demonstrated just a few episodes ago, is not supported by data at all. The president started a fight. The bipartisan amendment shows Congress is ready to finish that fight on his behalf. What is desperately missing is the political will to get it over the finish line and the public understanding of why it matters. And that's why Bust Big Pharma exists. That's why we're here. Because you deserve to be informed. Because you deserve to have the answers. Because you deserve to know who to call. I'm going to say something very, very clearly. I'm going to say it bluntly. Because on December 19th, 2025, 14 pharmaceutical companies shook the president's hand and promised most favored nation pricing. The president called it the greatest victory for patient affordability in the history of American healthcare. And then 12 days later, those same companies sucker punched the president when they announced they were raising prices on at least 350 drugs, when in reality it was 872. They shook the president's hand. They shook the president's hand and then they raised prices on 872 drugs. We are not finding solutions through voluntary action. But Big Pharma is finding delay tactics through voluntary action. And this is why we need to demand that Congress codify this legislation into law right now. You need to pick up the phone and you need to call your member of Congress. You need to get behind your computer and you need to email your member of Congress. You need to get on Facebook or Instagram or X or Truth, and you need to leave a post on your member of Congress's page telling them to codify most favored nation pricing. They keep track of it. They know what is being sent to their office. Be part of the solution. Have your voice be heard. The pharmaceutical industry is not unbeatable. It has never faced an administration as committed to the fight as this one. It has never faced a public informed as the American public is becoming on this issue today. And it has never faced a political alignment, conservative voters who want reform, a president who's pushing for it, and bipartisan congressional support building in real time, quite like they are at this moment. But what winning requires is understanding what kind of fight we find ourselves in today. It's not a negotiating fight. You do not negotiate your way to victory with an industry that raises prices on 872 drugs 12 days after signing a deal with the President of the United States. You legislate your way to victory. You take that handshake, you put it in statute, you attach penalties, you define compliance, and you enforce it. You pass the damn bill. The president knows this. He said so in the State of the Union. Now Congress needs to act. And in the meantime, every time you fill a prescription, every time you see the number on the receipt, I want you to remember the handshake. I want you to remember the 872 drugs. And I want you to remember the $177 billion in profit. And don't forget the $346 million in executive pay. And then I want you to call your member of Congress. Now I want to talk to you about a different number. The number is 51. 51%. That is the share of American cancer patients who go into debt as a result of the cost of their treatment. Not all cancer patients, not the most severely ill, not a fringe case, more than half. More than half of every American who receives a cancer diagnosis in this country goes into debt paying for the treatment that is trying to save their life. Now, the pharmaceutical industry has an answer for that number. They always do. They will tell you about the science, and they will tell you about the medical trials and the decades of research that went into the drug, and about all the brilliant scientists and the risk and the failure and how much they invest to get to that drug being on the shelf. And today, I'm going to walk you through what the data says about the relationship between what cancer drugs cost and what they actually do. Because if you're going to ask 51% of cancer patients to go into debt, the drugs had better be worth it. So let's find out if they are. And let's make sure we can tie this back to why Americans deserve most favored nation pricing. Cancer is the most personal subject this show has touched. I am aware of that. Almost every American has had cancer touch their family somehow, some way. It is not an abstraction. It's a parent, a sibling, a friend, a patient lying in the hospital bed wondering if this drug the doctor's talking about, this $25,000 a month drug, is going to work. That is exactly why the pricing of cancer drugs deserves the most rigorous examination that this show can give it. Because the stakes are not abstract. They are the most human stakes there have ever been. So let's start with where cancer drug pricing stands right now. In the first week of 2026, the first 7 days of the year, pharmaceutical companies raised prices on 64 oncology drugs, 64 of them, in just 7 days. At the start of a new year, when a good chunk of that new year is a holiday and people are even really paying attention to the news. 73% of those price hikes exceeded the rate of inflation. And the cancer drug already costs, on average, $74,000 more a year than other drugs on the market. Not more than inflation, more than other drugs. $74,000 more per year. That's just the baseline. 64 price hikes in 7 days in a category that already costs $74,000 more a year than average, resulting in more than half of cancer patients going into debt. So what are they getting for it? What are the patients benefiting from this? Well, when you look at peer-reviewed science, what they've found about the relationship between cancer drug prices and cancer drug effectiveness, researchers at the Journal of the American Medical Association examined cancer drugs approved by the FDA between 2015 and 2020. They looked at the price of each drug. Then they looked at the clinical evidence. How much did each drug actually help patients? Did it extend life? By how much? Did it improve quality of life? Did it slow disease progression? And then they asked, is there a correlation or a relationship between these things? Their finding was they didn't detect a meaningful association between cancer drug prices and the magnitude of clinical benefit of any of the endpoints they examined. None. Not a weak association, not a strong association, not a tangential association, not a complicated association. No meaningful association. A drug that extends life by 6 months costs the same as one that extended life by 6 weeks. A drug with strong quality of life data is not priced higher than one with marginal. There's no premium for performance. There's no discount for underperformance. The researchers' conclusion was direct. It was cancer drugs are priced based predominantly on what the market will bear. And we've talked about this before. We've used that phrase on this show before, what the market will bear. And I will tell you, that's a perfectly legitimate pricing philosophy for consumer goods, for sports cars and restaurant meals and designer shoes and that jewelry that you see in the jewelry case at the store. Where a consumer has a choice, where they have alternatives, they have the freedom to walk away. A person with stage 3 cancer does not have that freedom. They're no longer a consumer making rational market choices. They are human beings who will pay anything. They will mortgage their house. They will empty the retirement account. They will take on debt they may never pay off for a chance at more time. And the data says clearly that the pharmaceutical industry knows this and prices the cancer drugs accordingly. Now let's look at launch prices. The price is set when a new cancer drug first reaches the market, because this is where the industry's most significant pricing decisions are made and where the acceleration is most visible. The Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, an independent nonprofit that assesses the value of medicines, published a landmark analysis in October of 2025. They examined the launch prices of 154 newly approved drugs between 22 and 24. The inflation-adjusted median launch price, the actual price paid after rebates, increased by 51% from 2022 to 2024. 51% in 2 years, adjusted for inflation. The median annual cost of a new drug launched in 2024 was more than $350,000. In 2021, the same median was $180,000. In 2022, the median was $222,000. In 2023, it was $300,000. In 2024, $350,000. There's a line going in only one direction. And it's not stopping. ICER's president said it plainly after releasing the report. Urgent action is needed to increase affordability and access to medicine, not just for patients, but for society as a whole. That's not a minor concern. It is something that demands urgent action. IQVIA's analysis projects list prices will continue growing at least 6 to 9% annually through 2028. And there's no indication from the industry that any internal force is going to slow this down. And the reason why is because there's no internal force. The incentive to maximize launch price is structural. It is rational from the company's perspective. And it will continue until something outside the company stops it. Maybe that's where Donald Trump enters. Now let's get specific for a minute, because when you're specific, specificity is where your argument wins. The world's current best-selling drug is Keytruda, a cancer immunotherapy, a PD-1 inhibitor, approved for 18 different types of cancer. It's been administered to 2.9 million patients. And in 2024, it generated $29.5 billion in global revenue. $29.5 billion. One drug in a single year. We discussed this drug a few episodes ago when we examined the patent playbook being run to extend its exclusivity past 2042. So today we're going to break down what it costs and what patients get for that cost. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism, one of the most respected investigative outlets in the English-speaking world, published a detailed examination of Keytruda just this month, and here's what they found. Keytruda is extraordinarily expensive. The cost to patients varies by market and insurance coverage, but the drug regularly runs $200,000 or more per year in the United States. And the Bureau found something striking in how the pharmaceutical company who controls this drug recommends dosing the drug. They found that Keytruda is administered at doses that independent experts say could be substantially lower without reducing effectiveness. Because the pharmaceutical company who owns the patent and prices by dose, higher doses mean higher revenue. The company has a financial incentive to recommend doses that generate maximum revenue rather than minimum necessary doses that are more affordable. Now, like every other pharmaceutical company in the country, they dispute this. They say their dosing recommendations reflect clinical evidence, but the independent experts who reviewed the evidence disagree. Now, here's what's not in dispute. Keytruda has their primary patent expire in 2028. They've filed more than 1,200 patent applications on Keytruda across 53 countries. The Bureau found that 211 granted patents extended protection to at least 2042, a full 14 years after the original patent expires. and at least 337 more pending applications exist. A drug generating $29.5 billion a year, a patent fortress extending to 2042, and dosing questions that experts say could reduce patient costs significantly. But the company has financial reasons to resist. This is not a cancer drug priced to save lives. This is a cancer drug that's priced as a revenue franchise. It's managed to maximize extraction from patients, the very patients who are fighting for their lives. Now, when we talk about this, we have to talk about where cancer drug company money actually goes, because the industry's defense for these prices is always the same. R&D is expensive. Cancer research is hard. With these margins, the next breakthrough never happens. And in 2025, pharmaceutical companies increased spending on advertising for cancer treatments by 43%. Wait, what? Excuse me? You increased advertising spend on cancer drugs by 43%, while in the same year cutting your R&D budget by 29%? Let that land. Increased advertising by 43%, but cut research by 29%. But the directional pattern is real and is consistent with everything this show has documented. The BMJ found that the 15 largest pharma companies spent more on marketing than on R&D over a 20-year period. JAMA found no correlation between what companies spend on R&D and what they charge for the resulting drug. And JAMA found no correlation between what they charge and how well the drug actually works. So, when a cancer patient goes into debt, paying $350,000 a year for a drug whose price has no relationship to what it costs to develop and no relationship to how well it works, that patient's not funding innovation. They're funding a pricing system that has convinced Washington, patients, and the press that this is the same thing as innovation. But it's not. Now, we've talked a little bit earlier about the policy fight happening right now when it comes to codifying most favored nation pricing. We've talked about how important it is to reach out to Congress. We've talked about how important it is to have your voice heard. And this is why the policy fights continue to happen. The Inflation Reduction Act gave Medicare the authority to negotiate prices on high-cost drugs. For the first 10 drugs, prices fell from 38 to 79%. For cancer patients on those drugs, that is a material difference. Tens of thousands of dollars a year. The pharmaceutical industry is now pushing Congress to pass something called the EPIC Act, the Ensuring Pathways to Innovative Cures Act. It would delay when small molecule cancer drugs, the most commonly prescribed form of cancer treatment, become eligible for Medicare price negotiation. They wanted to delay it by 4 years. 4 years of continued full price extraction from cancer patients. Now, the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that legislation weakening the IRA's drug negotiation authority, including orphan drug exemption expansion already passed, will cost Medicare around $8.8 billion in foregone savings. While this lobbying push is underway, the industry has spent $452 million on federal lobbying in 2025. It's a record. And 3 lobbying firms close to the current White House took in nearly $11.7 million from pharmaceutical companies in 2025, 5 times what those same firms received from the industry in 2024. Now, they're not lobbying for cancer patients. They're lobbying against the tools that lower prices for cancer patients, with record money being thrown into the system, directed at the White House's own inner circle. That is not innovation. That's not even an innovation ecosystem. That is a political protection racket. So what changes this? What could possibly change this? It's 3 things. First, expand Medicare drug price negotiation to more drugs faster. The IRA's current schedule moves too slowly. The EPIC Act would make it slower still. Congress needs to reject EPIC and accelerate the negotiation timeline, not protect the companies currently extracting maximum prices from cancer patients. Second, require clinical value to factor into pricing. There is no law anywhere on the books requiring that drug prices bear any relationship to how well that drug actually works. That's an extraordinary gap in the regulatory framework. Other countries use health technology assessments, formal evaluation of a drug's clinical benefit relative to its cost, to inform pricing decisions. The United States does not require this, but it should. Third, close the patent gaming loopholes that extend cancer drug exclusivity well beyond the terms the patent system was designed to provide. Keytruda's 1,200 patent applications, most filed after initial approval, are not protecting scientific innovation. They're protecting a revenue franchise from competition. Congress has bipartisan legislation, the Affordable Prescriptions for Patients Act, that passed the Senate unanimously in 2024, and it needs to move in the House of Representatives. None of these reforms ask the pharmaceutical industry to stop innovating. None of these reforms tell them to stop and sit on their hands. They ask the industry to justify what it charges for the innovation it produces. That's not an unreasonable ask. It is, in fact, the baseline expectation of every other market in the American economy. Now, let's come back to where we started this segment, with 51%. 51% of American cancer patients go into debt as a result of the cost of their treatment. Hold on to that number. I gave you a lot of numbers to hold on to. I understand that. But hold on to 51. And I want you to hold it alongside some other numbers. You need to remember that there's no meaningful correlation between cancer drug prices and cancer drug effectiveness. You need to remember that 23 new drugs from most favored nation deal signers at an average launch price of $353,000 a year. That 64 cancer drug prices increased in the first week of this year alone. That advertising spending went up 43% while R&D was cut. That a lobbying campaign to delay Medicare negotiation on drugs that help cancer patients is being funded with record money directed at the president's own inner circle. And 51% of cancer patients are going into debt. Cancer is already among the hardest things a human being can face. The disease itself is brutal, the fear is real, and the uncertainty is relentless. The pricing system we have built around cancer medicine is making it worse, deliberately, knowingly, profitably. And that's what needs to change. Call Congress. Tell them to hold Big Pharma accountable. Tell your member of Congress that you demand more from them. Tell your member of Congress it's time for a bipartisan solution. Tell your member of Congress it's time to codify the president's healthcare policies, especially the ones that come to prescription drug pricing. This is Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. I'll see you next week.
The most annoying TV ads goes to Big Pharma.
I want to thank Washington for making America one of just 2 countries to allow my ads. Thank you, politicians, for making every commercial I run tax deductible. And to the American people, who pay more than any other country for the same medicines. Couldn't do it without you.
Visit bustbigpharma.com.
Now that guy's a winner.